Today I get to sit down with Shia Batista to hear what it's really like to lead a global youth movement. She started organizing climate strikes as a teenager and hasn't stopped since. Her leadership is shaped by her Otomi Toltec indigenous roots in Mexico and her upbringing in New York, and has shaped her role as a global voice for climate justice. She embodies how Gen Z is redefining leadership, collective, intersectional, and uncompromising. But behind the global climate leader is a real person balancing enormous expectations with the need to stay grounded. I'm Alex Honnold, professional rock climber and founder of the Honnold Foundation, bringing you stories of inspiring people helping solve today's most pressing conservation issues. In partnership with the Rolex Perpetual Planet Initiative, this is Planet Visionaries.
My name is Shia Bastida, and I'm a climate justice activist and co-founder of Re-Earth Initiative. My parents met at the first Earth Summit in 1992. I grew up with parents that would not stop talking about climate change, as they called it back then. And I thought my parents were weird, but turns out that they were just ahead of their time. When my hometown flooded when I was 13 years old, my life changed because I realized that the climate crisis was here and it was affecting my people, it was affecting my community, and I couldn't wait to grow up to do something. That's when I decided I was going to speak up, even if nobody would listen. I was going to start organizing. And by the age of 17, we co-organized the largest climate strike that New York had seen with 300,000 people. It's not just about the future and the innovation of climate solutions. It's about remembering our values, about remembering our core, remembering that we belong to Mother Earth. And when you have that type of worldview, you don't have to ever ask what your purpose is. And that's how my indigenous values are such a big part of my fight. I never have to ask why I do what I do. I just answer the calling of my ancestors. When I was in high school, I ended up in the hospital with heart palpitations from stress of organizing the climate march. I decided that's not what I want activism to be, because if activism burns you out, then we're not really fighting for the world that we want. And when I think of that, it makes me feel like it's a responsibility to be healthy, because I don't want to stop being an activist in a year. I want this to be my lifelong passion and commitment.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for making the time to come. So let's just dive right into it. You want to tell me who you are and what you do?
I'm a climate justice activist, and I come from an indigenous community in central Mexico called the Otomi peoples, from a family of activists. So definitely
you were
my
born
calling.
Into it?
Yeah.
You know, sometimes kids rebel against what their parents are into. How did you take the torch and keep running with it?
My parents met at the first Earth Summit in 92, which was the first time that the UN convened any sort of summit on climate.
Where was that?
In Rio, in Brazil. They were very young. My dad is Mexican, my mom is Chilean.
And they were both just passionate environmentalists?
They were passionate environment. My dad was there to speak on indigenous rights. And my mom was translating for him because my dad didn't speak English at the time. And when he finished his speech, he got up and left. My mom translated that, got up and left after him. And then he told her his life story and they fell in love. So really romantic. And then they kept seeing each other at some climate convenings of international youth working together. And I grew up with these stories. I grew up with my parents being really at the forefront of defending, for example, our wetlands, because my people are fishermen in Mexico. When I was 13 years old, my hometown flooded. And it wasn't just, like heavy rain. It was our river overspilling, one of the most contaminated rivers in Mexico. So it was a health crisis. It was a health issue. Our crops died. It was a real turning point for my community and for me to realize that the climate crisis was just amplifying so much of the injustice that my town was and my community was feeling. And that's how it started. When I think I woke up, even though I knew so much, it didn't hit me until I saw it.
I mean, basically, it's one thing to feel really inspired as a 13-year-old. It's another thing to actually do something.
Yeah.
And so how did you bridge that gap?
So we lived in Mexico then. And then my parents actually got a job offer from Karen Gore, Al Gore's daughter, to work in New York at the Center for Earth Ethics to talk about indigenous rights in a theological seminary. And so we moved to New York like that when I was 13, shortly after the flood. And first of all, the language barriers was hard, like adapting to a new country, a new school. And it was just a very shocking time for me. But then as I started to learn English, I started to get involved. I got into high school. When I was 15, my dad was invited to speak at a UN summit in Malaysia. And he couldn't go, so he asked the organizers like if I could go on his behalf. So I crossed the world at 15 years old and gave my first UN speech. And what happened was the adults were listening to me, and I didn't think that would happen. That is when I realized I needed to use my voice as a young person to show them that this is an intergenerational injustice and that they cannot leave us behind and out of the conversations. So when I went back to New York after that experience, I joined the Environmental Club, which was a very traditional environmental club in the sense that we were watching documentaries and doing challenges of being vegan for a day for the whole school, but nothing more was happening. So I decided that I was going to challenge my peers. So that's when we started organizing with different groups across the city. That's when we started busing kids to City Hall, to Albany, to talk to representatives. That's when it started, when I was marching down the streets of New York with thousands of kids and people just feeling the power that we have, the pavement shaking and thinking we are walking towards a different world.
How do you build up to that, basically?
I think the short answer is you join a group.
Or you just do it, I guess.
You just join a group, and if it doesn't exist, you start the group. And I think I've been surprised as to how many people want to act, but they don't know who to join, where to go, who to talk to, how to organize. And it's at school, it's in a university club, it's in your neighborhood, your building, even on social media. If you join a group of like-minded people and you want to create a difference, that is the most powerful thing we have. We are social beings, and we can post as many videos as we want on Instagram or whatever about the issues happening. But if you don't have a group of people that you can sit with and ideate and think about the world that we're building towards, it won't happen. Nobody's going to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves.
What kind of groups do you build, and how do you make sure that they include everybody, or everybody who's interested anyway?
At first, it was my environmental club.
Which was pre-existing at the school?
Yeah. And then I started to get connected to other environmental groups across the city. And I found People's Climate Movement. And I was the only person under 50 in those meetings because most people were retired and had time to work on climate. And I was the only youth in those meetings for week after week after week for months, taking notes, listening, learning. I'm
curious how you had this sort of gumption, the personal, like when you're the only young person showing up at these groups, did you feel included? Or like in a way, it's like if you don't see anybody who feels like one of your peers, what does it take for you to keep showing up there and sort of make it your own?
I think it was the fact that I was heard, that if I had something to say, they would listen to me. And then they empowered me. They told me, you can be the youth liaison of People's Climate Movement. That is like the value of adults believing in us is so big. It empowers you so much. So People's Climate Movement, and then I joined Fridays for Future New York. And then I realized we need to go to the second stage of this movement, which is when they ask us, so what do you want? We need to have an answer.
Yeah, what was the next stage?
The next stage is we were being invited to the United Nations. We were being invited to the UN General Assembly. So for example, now I'm in the Climate Advisory Council for Rockefeller Foundation. That is a huge responsibility.
2 years of demonstrating in front of the UN. What do you see as the result of that?
I started a nonprofit called Re-Earth Initiative about 5 years ago. And I would say we didn't become like a real organization. And the only reason why I say that is because we didn't receive funding until 2 years ago. Yes. And it makes a huge difference. And so one of our primary things that we do is called our regranting program, where the funds that we get, we don't see them as ours, we see them as for the movement. Mm-hmm. So we are redistributors of the funds that come through us. And we have supported 75 projects across the Global South of youth leadership with conservation and restoration of ecosystems and empowerment projects. And that is what gives me so much hope now, that we're doing things differently, that we're not competing with each other on scarce resources. We're having more of an abundance mindset of what everybody deserves, which is the people who are making it happen, the people who are changing their communities, educating, capacity building. That is really where the heart is.
So it's been 10 years that you've been sort of building movements like in the environmental space, working towards climate justice. What kind of changes do you feel like you've seen over the last decade?
10 years ago was more or less when the Paris Agreement was passed. And the Paris Agreement talks about how we need to limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees by halving our carbon emissions. And we're not on that track, right?
Totally.
Like we are, but we have made significant progress. So we were going towards 4 degrees of warming, and then we're going towards more or less 3 degrees of warming. And that's one of the main messages that we have is every fraction of a degree matters, and everything we do to stop the climate crisis matters, because that means so many lives. There's been significant changes and advancements, for example, with Pacific Island students fighting climate change. They're the ones who brought this advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice for states' responsibility on climate, because the island nations are going to be underwater if we don't stick to 1.5 degrees. So I think we're seeing leadership from a lot of different places, coming from youth, coming from frontline communities, from island nations. We're seeing more countries than ever endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're seeing renewables being the cheapest that they have ever been. There's a lot less education to be done, and there's a lot more implementation. And I think that's why we're also pushing for not only countries, but also the private sector and different industries to commit to 2050 targets on net zero, to even 2040, 2045 targets on net zero. And that's why we keep showing up, because we cannot think that the climate solutions can be put in the back.
Well, so I'm kind of curious about the intergenerational piece of coalition building and all these kinds of things. Like, talk about organizing across generations.
I think that's where a lot of my values from the indigenous worldview and cosmology come in, because we sit around a fire and listen to our elders tell us stories of our creation, our prophecies. There's a lot of communities that every morning they sit together to just talk about their dreams and what that means. In our modern world, the only places in which youth interact with adults is in internships and fellowships, and we just don't have the cultural spaces for deep intergenerational learning to be built.
Yeah, that's interesting, because actually I think in the climbing world, you actually maybe get a little more crossover with that than in other places, because when I was a kid growing up as a climber, many of the people who first took me outside were old, basically retired people who had the time to take me climbing. But it's interesting because I think climbing, maybe unique among many sports, has a wide, basically an 11-year-old can climb as well as a 60-year-old, can climb as well as a 30-year-old. It basically just comes down to, can you climb this wall? And so you'll often go to the cliff and find yourself climbing next to really old people or really young people, and just kind of be like, well, it turns out this 9-year-old is climbing better than me today on this random wall. And you're like, okay, like that's just the way it goes. But you're right that in normal life, you really just don't experience that very often. But yeah, I'm curious where it is interesting because all the inspiration in my life has been drawn from the very specific, the climbing world that I care so much about. I'm curious, where do you draw inspiration from, to sustain this kind of work?
So I think for me, it's the people that have been doing this their entire lives. People like Sylvia Earle, people like Mary Robinson, the people that have never given up, because it's part of how they live, is who they are. There's so much narrative around having that youth voice. And when you're so empowered, when you can speak because the young voice makes it different, then I have to think that it's okay to evolve. But also, what am I doing to make sure that the doors that were opened for me never close again for the next generation coming up?
I've had the pleasure of interviewing Sylvia Earle for Planet Visionaries. And I was also very struck by how passionate she's remained for so long in the same field. But I'm curious, like, how do you become Sylvia Earle?
There's this saying in my community that nature is a practice. You have to practice being in nature, going and getting to know the plants. And, I've been to communities where not only the grandmas, but the youth know all the medicinal plants. And I've seen communities that still have so much of their identity. And in a way, my grandma reminds me of Sylvia. What made her so incredible was that everybody who came to her, she took care of like it was part of her family. And I think that's what Sylvia does. Like, she's so humble. We were out just in the water and she collected all these seaweeds and then she was taking pictures of them. I don't know if you knew that her PhD, she did it on seaweed, and she has the largest catalog of seaweed of anybody in the world. And even if she did that decades ago, and even she can look at it and still feel wonder, still be marveled at it.
Yeah, being amazed. And how important do you think painting a sort of positive vision in the future is for the climate movement? I mean, when you're saying people sort of forget that we're connected to a natural world, I mean, do you feel like that's part of the climate movement, or?
100%.
Because I actually think that's something that the climate movement more broadly has been sort of lacking,
Yes.
at least in my years, is that you rarely get a positive environmental picture. You know, people rarely paint the picture of like, this is what the world could be with a few tweaks, like, you know, with some important changes.
Yeah. No, I actually love this topic because there's this institute called the Institute of the Future, of people who spend their lives imagining futures. And they found through a study that they did that if you think of what you did exactly today, last year, and that memory, like triggering that memory, uses 5 parts of your brain. But if I ask you, think of waking up in 10 years. Where are you waking up? Who are you with? What are you passionate about? What are you looking forward to? Try to do it.
I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
Waking up at home in Las Vegas with my wife, and you know, I have 2 daughters, and they would be in high school then. I just turned 40, so I'm like, oh, then I would be just turning 50. I'm like, will I still be trying to climb the hardest thing right then? I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to think about. But so, to what effect?
So, what does the world look like in 10 years? Are all of the places that you love climbing still there? Is the same? Are they better? Is there more people? Is there less people? All of these questions that are very specific.
Mm-hmm.
When you envision the world in that specificity, you activate 11 parts of your brain. And when you challenge yourself to not just think about what you think that future might look like, but the best possible version of it, you start to behave towards that reality that you envisioned. And our collective vision of the future is one that is worse than it is today. So envisioning and challenging ourselves to think positively about the future is one of the best and strongest climate solutions we have.
With building a global climate movement, it's like, how many people do you think are sort of inherently optimistic about climate versus inherently pessimistic about climate? And to what effect do you think that actually influences their actions and like what they do?
I actually think that youth we're in kind of, it's split into 2 groups, the most empowered and active we've ever been, but also the biggest consumer base and the most stressed. And we're not talking to each other, and we're in a digital age that's kind of bringing us apart. So we need to bring those groups together and figure out how we're going to make sure everybody's going on the right path. I can never speak to my grandchildren, possible grandchildren, future grandchildren, and tell them that I lost hope for even a second. I could never talk to my grandmother and tell her that all of her sacrifice was not worth me fighting every single day. I could never even let myself for 1 minute imagine that we lose, because if I let go of that hope and that optimism, then I feel like I'm failing the people who are fighting alongside me. So we owe our optimism and our hope and our fire to the people who are showing up with us. And if I see you that you're like, we can do this, things are going to be fine, what does it look like for you to be 1% more courageous? And that's my question for everybody. What can make you 1%, 2% more courageous so that you're not just taking things for granted or thinking that certain things might work out, but doing the extra step so that you are part of that movement?
Shia, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. I think maybe we should leave it with just this last question, with just what you just said. So what is the best way for the average person to take that first step? Like, what do you do?
When people have this question of what can I do, is because something just inspired them. Like they watched something, a documentary, a speech, something moved them. And so that is the internal fire that lights up. And what I would tell those people is take care of that fire. What do you feed that fire? Don't let the spark go out. Is it going to be a group that you join? Is it going to be a protest that you go to? Is it going to be emails that you write or a community gathering that you can call together? Is it going to be informing yourself about legislation that can pass, or creating cultural spaces for the climate space? We need every single person. We need exactly you to be in this movement, because this is the movement that is amplifying all injustice, but it's also the biggest opportunity we have to get it right.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining me, Shia. We will put links to Re-Earth Initiative in the show notes. And thank you for listening to Planet Visionaries, a Sony Music Entertainment production in partnership with the Rolex Perpetual Planet Initiative.